Great. Thanks a lot for having me. It's a pleasure to be in Santiago de Chile virtually today. And I would like to present some work I did with Yuli Sannikov on the international monetary theory, a risk perspective, which is very different from a price rigidity perspective. It's very much focused on the risk dimension. And the question we would like to address is, so when can a country have its own currency, and when will it be dollarized? And by currency, we mean much more a store of value aspect. So it's not really the medium of exchange thing aspect we emphasize here so much. And when will it be the case that the stop occurs and the currency collapses, essentially? Then we also would like to know to what extent US monetary policy is spilling over to the emerging market economy. So we have a small open economy in mind, very much like Chile. That was actually our example when we wrote the paper. And then we asked, secondly, first is what's in equilibrium? When can a country have its own currency as a store of value? And when is it socially optimal to have your own currency? And what's the policy space you have under different policy space in terms of imposing capital controls or monetary policy? What is the optimal policy at this stage? And keep in mind, in our setting, there are two stores of value possible, two forms of money or stores of value or government debts in a sense. They have a different risk profile because, they're not total perfect substitutes like in many earlier models. Here, we live in a world of risk, and different currencies have different risk profiles. So let me outline what I would like to do. So we have a model where there's money, and money has value due to frictions, and it's very much frictions as a store of value component, not as a medium of exchange. And it's a safe asset perspective on money. So money, or more generally, we consider a broad class of money, even including government debt. So it's not a narrow set of money, it's a broad definition of money. And individuals receive idiosyncratic risks, and they get country-wide income shocks as well. Okay, and then you would like to hold money because you face a negative shock, you have a health shock, suddenly you have some health expenditures. You would like to have an asset which can easily be sold to somebody else, and you pay your health bill, or your washing machine breaks down, you have to pay your washing machine. Somebody else doesn't have this negative shock or even has a positive shock and can actually, buy this safe asset from you. So, and why do you want to have this? Because they're liquid markets. You cannot insure against some healthcare shocks. Or you can also think of a COVID shock, and it affects different people differently. Some online businesses benefited and other businesses suffer from that. And ex-ante, you could not write contracts on that. So there's no consumption smoothing across individual states because markets are incomplete. And there's costly and it's costly to have against countrywide shocks some insurance as well. So that's the main friction. These are financial frictions, these are incomplete markets frictions. But you want to smooth consumption across time and across the states, and that's why you save in this currency or this government debt store of value. And that's very similar to the I theory of money, where there is one country with one government bond or money form of money. Here we have now two countries, and the two currencies compete with each other. And understanding this, how the dollar competes with the peso, with the local peso. Think of the US dollar and the local peso, the Chilean peso. Okay. What are the equilibrium results? The equilibrium results are, if you vary the idiosyncratic risk, the value of the peso is highly endogenous. Now it moves around over time. As the economy moves, the growth rate goes up and down. So the peso is moving, and inflation essentially, the price level is moving around. And the value of the peso is inverted U-shaped in idiosyncratic risk. Okay, if idiosyncratic risk is very low, then there's not much reason to hold currency. You hold more physical capital because it has a higher dividend payment. If the idiosyncratic risk is very high, the growth rate in the economy is depressed, and actually then the dollar takes over. We will see that. And if there's an intermediate range where actually the peso can live. And if the idiosyncratic risk goes up too much, then there's a sudden stop. A small shock can actually destroy the value of the Piezo. And there's huge capital outflows suddenly out of the Piezo into the US dollar. The other element is that there's huge monetary spillovers from the United States onto Chile. And whether a country borrows or holds dollars might vary a lot. Okay, so in certain parameter spaces, in certain points in time, firms feel emboldened to borrow in dollar-denominated debt because it's very cheap. If the US dollar interest rate is very cheap, and certain points in time, they want to hold dollar treasuries because it's their safe asset, their store of value they would like to have. Okay, it's a little bit vague at this point, but we have to set up the model to understand it. But just to get the big picture where we want to go. So that's equilibrium outcome. In terms of optimal outcome, we do optimal monetary policy or optimal policy more generally in the small open economy setting. So there's Chile, it's a small open economy, and then there's the US, which is the large economy. So the policy depends very much on the policy space. The supply of the public debt or the money is of the total fiscal debt outstanding by Chile, and then the fiscal backing of the local currency. You can back it with fiscal future primary surpluses, and you can back it with dollar reserves as a local authority. And of course, the value of the money has a bubble component to it as well. And I will come to this, what the bubble component, where it comes from. And then there's some equilibrium outcomes and the optimal policy outcomes. In the capital flow sense, the equilibrium outcome is that capital flows from the south to the north. The policy is actually should be the other way. The optimal outcome would be the other way around. And the key determinants of the dollar holdings in equilibrium, if there's more idiosyncratic risk, people would like to hold more dollars. There's flight to safety, holding dollars. The optimal outcome actually is that you ensure you use the safe asset, the Piezo safe assets, the Piezo government debt and Piezo currency, you use to insure against idiosyncratic risk, but you use the dollar to insure against what country-wide risks. That would be the optimal outcome, but to implement that is not so easy, and we will see that. As I mentioned before, if the US changes its dollar interest rate, it has huge spillovers onto Chile. What's the related literature? I mean, of course, there are a lot of papers where money has value because it's a good insurance vehicle, because underlying incomplete markets, idiosyncratic risk is not insurable. Bewley's 1980 money papers, Ayagari type papers, Ayagari McGrattan applies it to public debt. In our setting, we also have a broad set of money. In these models, it's always endowment risk. Okay, so it's endowment is idiosyncratic endowment risk. In ours, it's not the endowment which is risky, or the labor endowment is actually the physical capital which is risky. So if you invest more, if you hold more physical capital, you scale up the idiosyncratic risk. So the idiosyncratic risk scales up with your capital holdings. That's a big difference. That makes the model much more attractive. And it's very close to the I theory of money, when the I theory of money is essentially just a closed economy with one form of money. Here, it's a small open economy with competing forms of money or government debt, in a sense, the US versus Chile. There's also Mendoza, Quattrini, Ruiz Rule, and Angelettos have papers with different idiosyncratic risk and global imbalances, explaining why this, has different interest rates across countries and others. As Gray Ventura has a continuous time model, how to respond to transitory shocks. It's more similar because we also use continuous time. And to use public debt as a safe store of value and tax smoothing aspect. So the tax smoothing aspect is not the primary driver in our setting, like in Angeletto's, Colas, and Dellas. And of course, we have something to say about the capital controls and the trilemma, Mandel-Fleming trilemma. In our setting, we have a dilemma in a sense that, and that shows my recent policy paper on the safe asset perspective on the integrated policy framework. It does spell out most clearly, even though we have total flexibility in currencies, you have no independent monetary policy. And that's very clear in this framework. Now, in order to understand asset pricing and how the value of certain assets are, there are two assets primarily in this framework, or three assets, sorry. There is physical capital, there is the Piezo debt, or government debt, or currency, and then there's the dollar debt. These are the three assets. And typically, the way we do asset pricing, we always say, the asset price is expected discounted cash flow in form of dividends or interest using a stochastic discount factor. I would like to extend this asset pricing framework to saying we also have assets which give you some service flows. And I want to be a little bit more specific because that's important to understand. Okay, so that's what are the service flows? So one specific example is if you have an asset which is a very good collateral, it relaxes some collateral constraint. The Lagrange multiplier is the value of the relaxation of the collateral constraint. That's a service flow. But the element here I would like to emphasize a lot is the safe asset component. And that's this component here. And that's what you have if you have a market with incommit markets. So if the economy has incommit markets, and you suffer a shock, an idiosyncratic shock or an aggregate shock, a safe asset is an asset which keeps its value when you suffer a shock. And you can sell it to somebody else without a high bid-ask spread. So the market liquidity is high and the value stays high. And I call it the good friend analogy of a safe asset. So it's like a safe asset is like a good friend. A good friend is a friend indeed in times of need. And a similar thing here is true as well. Here, if you're in need of funding because you suffered a negative shock, you can sell it and get some funds from it. And in this framework, what it does, you can re-rate the safe assets. Whoever has a funding need can sell it and get some funds and buy something. And that gives them partial insurance. So even though it is incumbent markets, we cannot insure each other against shocks, let's say health shocks in particular forms. We can hold these safe assets, and whenever some guys have a health shock, they can sell it to somebody else who didn't get the health shock, and this way we can partially insure each other. And that's what the safe asset is. It's a service flow, and even if it has no cash flow at all, it pays no interest. Let's suppose it's a consul bond which pays no interest at all. That's what money is, regular money which pays no interest. Reserve now pay interest. But let's say you take a consul bond which pays no interest, it has the service flow, and that gives the value of the money in a broad sense. Now you can take a narrow sense of money, and that's typically used in the literature, where money is derived from a double coincidence of wants problem. You have to impart the economy. You might not need the guy who has the same needs, what you can offer, and what you need from the other guy. That's double coincidence of wants issue. And money relaxes that, and that's another service flow. It relaxes another cash in advance constraint like Lagrange multiplier or money utility function and other things. That's another service flow, and that's another way to do that. So typically, what I focus here is on the safe asset component. I don't focus, if you have narrow money, you can put it in the model, get another element. I will ignore that for now. There's no double coincidence of wants problem, no cash in advance, but there's a safe asset component. That's what I focus on. I also don't focus on collateral aspects. And the higher the service flow is in form of safe asset, the higher is the price of the assets, and hence the lower cash flow expected return. Okay? Now, the problem with the safe assets is, and also more generally with the money status, is that it can be like a bubble and might burst. It's not stable. It's not clear why a safe asset is attached to a particular asset. Why is it attached to the government bond? It can be attached to anything. And there are multiple equilibria. The safe asset might go away, might jump from one asset to another asset, or you might jump in a bad equilibrium where there's no asset offering the service flow. And that's what I call a safe asset tautology. A safe asset is safe because it's safe. But more precisely, because it's perceived to be safe, there's a self-fulfilling expectations phenomenon. It's multiple equilibria going on. That's the second very important characteristics of safe assets. So the two characteristics I would like to stress is the good friend analogy, liquid and keeps value when you need it, and the safe asset tautology, this multiple equilibrium story bursting bubble story. And in our setting, money and will be a bubble to some extent, or it's, the government can issue some money and riding on a bubble. So I have a recent paper, which is with Sebastian Merkel and Yuli as well, on the fiscality of the price level with a bubble. Okay. The important thing is the intertemporal budget constraint has to take a bubble component into account to fully reflect that. So how does we put this into this model? It's a small open economy. Individuals can produce goods from capital. It's an AK economy. There's no labor, it's just capital. And A is in aggregate productivity. Individuals use money, the local currency or government debt, that's the same thing in this model, to save against idiosyncratic risk shocks. Okay, there's an investment shock. Capital, if you hold more capital, you're more exposed to risk. And they can also save and borrow in dollars to absorb countrywide risk shocks. So that would be the ideal outcome. And the interesting aspect is dollar savings also protect you against the individuals, against this idiosyncratic risk. And so you don't know how these two currencies compete with each other. And of course, given this, you can freely trade these two currencies. The risk rate is determined endogenously. What monetary policy can do is endogenously, and all this. And we will see how this plays out. So perhaps a break for 1 second now. If there are any questions about the motivation, then I move into the model.
There is no question so far.
Okay. Okay, so here's the model. It's a very standard model in a sense. It's continuous time. Everybody has constant relative risk aversion utility function with a risk aversion coefficient of gamma. The intertemporal elasticity of substitution is 1 over gamma. And what's important is the time reference rate is rho. Okay, oops, sorry. And then I have the evolution of net worth. That's a citizen in Chile is denoted by I tilde. Tilde is always idiosyncratic. Okay, that's the net worth of a citizen in country in Chile. Okay, so he can hold a portfolio share theta dollars, he holds in dollars, he gets the interest rate in dollars, that doesn't move around, that's deterministic, the dollar interest rate. The numeraire is everything is in dollars. Okay, there's no price rigidity, no frictions, there's no tradable, non-tradable sector, so everything is very, very standard, very simple. Okay. Then you can hold some pesos, so that's the portfolio share in pesos. That's my peso sign, even though I know the dollar sign initially was a peso sign. And you get the return on money. That's what RM. That's a real return. And then the remaining 1 minus the dollar share you put in the dollars and the share you put in pesos, that's the share you put in physical capital. That's the return on capital. And then you consume, that's your consumption rate. So that's goes out with minus. That's how net worth goes down if you consume at a higher rate. Okay. So that's pretty much the problem of an individual guy. Now, each individual guy can hold some capital machines, okay, and it produces some output, and it produces output a little a times k. Okay, that's the output you produce. And here, the output you really produce, sorry, I should have said it, is that's your output rate. It's accumulated, it's a D term because it's the accumulated one. So D is just the next instant of output. And the A times K is what you produce. Iota times K is you reinvest some of the output. So you produce, let's say, apples, or let's say for Chile, let's say wine. You produce wine, let me call it wine. And then there's part of the wine you put aside in order to plant new wine, the new capital goods. That's the iota. That's the total output you can consume is this one. But there's also a shock to it. There's a countrywide shock that's given by this Brownian here, multiplied by the sigma, which is the volatility of the country. And everything is proportional to K. And then there's an idiosyncratic shock, which depends on the idiosyncratic risk. That's why there's this I tilde on top of it. Okay, so whenever there's a tilde, or the C as a tilde, it means there's idiosyncratic risk to it. Okay. So how does the capital stock evolve? the capital stock evolves. So you get some additional capital stock if your investment rate is higher times. So this is my adjustment cost function phi. So it's a concave function. So if the investment rate, if you don't invest at all, invest a little bit, it gives a lot of extra capital stock. If you invest more, it becomes concave, and then there's a depreciation rate of delta. And then you can also buy some capital stock either from your fellow citizens or from abroad. Okay, so the purchasing rate is this d delta. That's how much you buy. And the main numeraire is the dollars, and this little dollar sign. So it's whenever you use capital, it's the aggregate for the country. Here, my dollar sign smaller. It's just what your dollars are. So your dollars, that's the return you get on your dollar holdings as an individual citizen. That's how much you consume. The dollars go down. That's your output from selling what you have. In everything is numeraire in dollars. And if you buy some machines, then you have to pay for the machine. The price of a machine is Q times K, how many machines you buy, because how many machines you buy is the whole thing here. Yeah? And this could be negative too if you sell it. Okay. Now, the purchase of the capital machines, the purchase is given by this delta D delta K, and it's done by the price of Q, and the Q lives in this range. Okay, so there's a world physical capital market. If you buy within the country, you buy at a Q. If you want to buy from abroad, you have to buy at Q upper bar. If you want to sell to abroad, you have to sell at Q lower bar. So there's a bit of ask spread if you go to, or some transaction costs or whatever, some transportation costs, if you want to sell machines across the border. Okay, and domestically, if you don't need to buy from abroad, there's a Q lives in this range. And as soon as you have too much purchase pressure, at some point you have to go abroad, and then everybody buys a Q upper bar. So the price of the machines lives between Q lower bar and Q upper bar. And in the extremes, you participate in the global market. Okay. Now the financial frictions are the following. So the first financial friction is that you have a countrywide shock, and you cannot insure against the foreigners. That's the countrywide shock, DC. And then you have each citizen on its own in this country has an idiosyncratic output shock. That was this one that comes, that's this guy here. You can't insure either. In your restaurant, there's some certain foot traffic, it's volatile, you cannot insure. And then we have a third constraint of financial friction. You can borrow in dollars, but you have to come up with some collateral. Okay, and the dollar amount borrowing you can do depends, what's the value of your physical capital. So the dollar borrowing, the dollar holding can be negative, but not more negative than minus Q lower bar. Okay, Q lower bar is if you have to fire sell your assets to the global global machine market. That's what you get, Q lower bar, and that's your collateral constraint. Okay. Are there any questions about the setup so far?
So if you have any question, please ask in the Q&A, and we will open the mic for you. Right now, there is no question.
Okay. So just trying to make sure that everybody understands the setup. Now I move to aggregate state variables and the asset prices. So that I first described what's individual citizens. Now at the whole country level, that's now the capital K and the capital dollar holding of the whole country. Okay, capital dollar holding can be negative if you borrow, or positive if you hold dollar as safe asset. So that's the same. We had, it grows. The investment rate IOTA is the same for everybody. Depreciation rate, and then the whole country can buy something. There's a capital K now here, or sell. And this is when you sell some machines, and this is when you buy machines. So the capital sales abroad is always done at Q lower bar. Capital purchases are done at Q upper bar, and that's why this Q lower bar, this Q upper bar is showing up, or this delta lower bar and this delta upper bar is showing up here too. It shows here in the dollar holdings, you have to pay this with dollars. When you buy, when you buy some machines, you have to pay Q up a bar, and that's why it goes with minus, then your dollar holdings go down. If you sell machines, you get only Q lower bar. That's why your dollar holdings goes down. So you get your dollar interest rate, and then you consume from that. And then, of course, you can sell your output goods as well. And that's why the dollar holdings. So everything is done in the numerator of dollar. Of course, there's also some Piezo activity going on, but that's in the background showing up here. Okay. Now, how does it? So everything is an K model. So everything is scales with K. Okay. So I want the dollar holdings. I also want to do a scaled with K. So it all say the treasury bond holdings or dollar holdings is my numerator. I want to scale it to K, so I write everything in terms of my dollar holdings in terms of nu times K. Where nu is just the dollar holdings per capital unit in the economy. Okay, so then this is just using Ito's formula. I just split this apart. So this d nu is just this nu. Then I have the dollar interest rate I get. Then of course I have now the K is also moving, so that's the K aspect. So let me put it this way: nu is equals to dollar holdings divided by K. Okay, so I have the drift of, and my drift of the dollars is this minus the drift of K, because by Ito's product rule it is minus this because it's in the denominator. Then I have then I get some additional dollar holdings from output from this element here. This was A minus iota from the output, and then I have the consumption. So I should say this is the consumption rate per unit of capital. Let's define this way. That's consumption per divided by K. Okay, and then I get the shocks, and I get the same elements from up here, from purchasing capital or selling capital. Okay. So my state variable will be the dollar holding per unit of capital, and that will be the state variable in the system. So if you have two economies, let's say you have Chile, and then you have another economy which is only half the capital stock as Chile, and they face the same sequence of shocks, they will be identical. Okay, it's just scaled version, so Chile is twice as large as the other economy. Now, here's the value of a domestic currency. That's the value of all pesos together, and including government debt in Chile. What is the value of that? And what's the return? So the value of this is also scaled by K. So I scale it as well. So I can write the value of all pesos, that's P times K, but I want to write it as little p times K because I descale it later by K. And K is my other state variable. So there are two state variables. One is nu and one is K, but K is a passive state variable. It's purely driven by this iota and by these purchases, which I can treat separately. There's no other feedback on that. So the main state variable is really my nu, okay? So I want to descale everything by K, and that's why I also write PT times KT is the value of all the pesos. Now, what's the return on the pesos? That's the return on my money. That's given by this thing here. That depends on the growth rate of the economy. Think of an economy which grows, where the money supply is fixed and it grows at 3%. So K is growing at 3%, so that's the size of the economy in a sense, grows at 3%. But then there will be the growth rate of this 3% is coming and coming, and there will be 3% inflation. So the growth rate of the economy is my growth stock of K, which is the investment rate, gives me some additional minus the depreciation rate. So if there's no money supply growth, then that's what it is. The economy grows at 3%. Money supply growth is not growing, then the return on money is 3% because there's 3% inflation. Now, if the money supply grows at 4%, then my real return on the pesos is minus 1% because the 3% growth of the economy minus 4% gives me minus 1% real return on holding peso broad sense. Think of safe assets, government debt, and pesos. There's no default risk in the government debt. What's the return on physical capital? The physical capital is capital K. Q is the value of a single machine. So Q times K is the value of all machines. And there's country-wide risk, sigma scaled, and then there's idiosyncratic risk, sigma tilde. Okay. What is the return on capital? So the return on capital is A times I minus iota times K is the total output which can be used for consumption. A times K is total output. Iota times K is used for reinvestment. So 8 minus iota, the whole thing times K is my physical output I can use for consumption. Divided by Q, that's essentially what I can use. That's my expected dividend yield. Okay. But of course, the output is also driven by these shocks, by these output shocks. One is a countrywide shock, and one is idiosyncratic shock. So there should be an iota tilde here. That's for a single guy. Okay. Now the return on capital is first the dividend yield, but there might also be capital gains on it. Okay. In this model, capital gains are deterministic, and it's just the growth rate of the economy. Okay. Again, the Q is moving around, and K is moving around. K is just moving by the growth rate. That's the capital gains rate. And then there's another element. If I print money, I create seigniorage. Remember, I print money at the rate of 4%. I create seigniorage. The question is, what do I do with this seigniorage? Okay. Suppose I give the seigniorage to incentivize capital owning, then I get the seigniorage component here too. And you have to normalize it because how much seigniorage you get depends on the money supply growth rate, but there's a relative what's the value of money and what's the value of capital showing up here. Okay. And I should say you can distribute the seigniorage also differently relative to net worth. It would result in a similar formula because if you print more money, you tax essentially currency holdings, and you subsidize as you pay back. Doesn't really matter how you pay back, except lump sum. But then you subsidize capital. Okay. So if you are an individual citizens in Chile, you think you're sitting there and you have a negative shock, and when there's a negative shock, suddenly you have very low output in your company, then your currency is actually going, the holdings are going down, and you would like to buy more, or your capital is destroyed or something, you want to rebalance your portfolio share. That's for individual citizens, and you just take Q as given. Now, if you have a countrywide shock, so the total output in the whole country is going down, then you can't rebalance, and you have to interact with the global economy, and you have some SS bounds. Okay, so to go beyond the local economy, you have to, as I mentioned before, if you want to buy some additional capital stock, you have to pay Q upper bar. If you want to sell some capital stock, you only get Q lower bar. Okay. The prices react to optimal portfolio weights don't change. So you always want to have this optimal portfolio weight. Everybody in the economy in Chile wants to have the same optimal portfolio weight because of the constant relative risk aversion setup. Everybody's the same in this regard. And everybody wants to adjust, but cannot adjust gradually. At some point you dip into global markets, and then the Q is actually going down to Q lower bar, or you want to sell, buy in the global markets, and Q goes up all the way to Q upper bar. And the Q lives in there, depending whether you go in the global markets or not. And that's how the economy works in this setting. Yeah? So that's the model setup. And what I want to do next is to show that, let me simplify the model. Let me switch off the aggregate shock. And I only have idiosyncratic shock. So in Chile, the whole Chilean economy has no aggregate risk with respect to the US or the rest of the world. It's just idiosyncratic shocks. And I first look at the case where there are only pesos, there's no dollars. So think of capital controls. Citizens can only hold pesos. They are not allowed to hold any dollars. And then I allow dollars to come in. And then I say, okay, what is the equilibrium outcome? And then I want to show what would be the optimal outcome. Okay. And then in the second step, I will go on and say, okay, now let me look to the other extreme. So first I look at only idiosyncratic risk, then I look at only countrywide risk, okay? So there's no idiosyncratic risk anymore, there's only the whole country has a copper shock or whatever. But there's no idiosyncratic risk within the country. There are perfect financial markets that can insure everything. And then I would like to combine both where you have both types of shocks and to show what's going on with that. So generalization, but the intuition comes from the special cases already. Okay? So now it's another good time to ask questions.
So Markus, I am Ernesto, and I have a quick question. Putting mathematical convenience aside, why is that you want to set up the model in a way that the size of the country is irrelevant? I'm asking because of the normalization of the state variable.
So essentially, so we solve for the whole global solution. So we don't solve just around the steady state. And the fewer state variables you have to solve. So in this framework, because K is pretty much moving independently, just driven by iota, I can actually solve ODEs, ordinary differential equations. If I have two state variables, I can still do it, but I have partial differential equations to worry about. And we can handle 2 or 3 state variables for global solutions, but if it goes beyond, it's very, very tricky. And we're developing something here with machine learning where we can solve more state variables, but it's of course also much harder to interpret. So that's why we went with this AK model, and also for a setting where you can separate essentially the K dynamics from the dollar holdings, these new dynamics, and that makes sense. There was another question.
Okay, so let me ask you the same question in a slightly different way. What is the cost of getting the mathematical convenience of reducing the system to only one state variable regarding what can you not analyze regarding the size of countries or some other aspects that the analysis get limited because of mathematical convenience?
So I think the costs are not high. The cost might be if you think a small country has more countrywide shocks, I can only do it in an exogenous way to increase the sigma dz, saying, a country like Chile is a small country, it has huge shocks, while a country like the US has many more industrial sectors, it can diversify across sectors much better. This I cannot analyze.
So I think
so I have to do it exogenously, essentially, by changing the sigma, sorry.
Okay, but that's good enough. But also something that comes to my mind that maybe the international spillovers on the emerging economy probably is going to be unrelated to the scale of the country, but in reality, the scale of the country may matter. So I don't know, like ceteris paribus, a Chile of the size of Indonesia may be exposed to international spillovers different than a Chile of the size of the actual Chile.
That's correct. But it's primarily, I would say it's the same exposure besides the fact that you can diversify within the country much better because you're exposed. But I think you can still, the only thing you have to do in this model is to change the sigma to say, okay, if Chile were 10 times as large, the sigma should be smaller because there's some diversification. You're not only driven by copper prices, but copper is just one industry within the country. And there are 25 industries which are important. But if there's some endogenous feedback on this, we will not cover. That the fact that a big country has some other endogenous feedback, and I cannot see it at the moment that there might be an important endogenous feedback.
Okay, great, thank you. There is also another question there are 2 more questions. One, Andres Fernandez, can you unmute yourself, Andres?
Hello? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Markus. Okay. Markus, thank you so much. This is Andres Fernandez. It's a clarifying question, rather. Sorry if I missed this. I was not at the beginning of the presentation. But why do you need the restrictions on QT? And do they matter for the results?
You will see that essentially all what I need is this collateral constraint, where you can only borrow up to the value of the collateral. And for this, I need this. You mean the Q lower bound, Q upper bound? That's what you're referring to, right?
Yes. Yes.
That's when the global markets kick in, and that's otherwise there would be no natural collateral constraint. So it will become clearer when I go there. Then there would, if the interest rate of the US is very low, they will borrow infinite amounts. You don't want to go there.
Okay, I see. But because normally Q, the adjustment in Q, which can bring about some deflationary spirals in assets, is what gives much of the action in financial models. So I was wondering, why do you want to?
It's the price of machines. It is still the case that Q is moving around, and thus this, it's just, it cannot go below Q lower bar, because then suddenly you can actually go to international markets and buy at Q lower bar.
Okay.
Q lives in this range, because if it were to go beyond that, you're a small open economy. The global market for machines will just determine the price.
And why do you need the upper bar bound?
The upper bar I don't really need. It's just for symmetry reasons. I just want the price of Q moving in these two areas. I think it's very natural to just assume, you know, there's an internal price, there's some frictions why there's an internal price which is different from the world price, because the transaction costs. But the world price, if the internal price goes out of whack too much, the world price kicks in and takes over. That's
fine. Okay, thank you.
Ask Fernando.
Hi, Markus. Couple of quick questions. First, a conjecture about what you just discussed. I think the Q upper bar and lower bar are just a way of getting a simple way of getting an international demand for capital, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And second, can you elaborate a little bit on the intuition? Because I get that capital is going to be affected by idiosyncratic risk, but at the end of the day, both values, peso and dollars, are going to be depend on aggregate risk. So I don't know why you have this asymmetric result that pesos are going to be linked to idiosyncratic risk and dollars none. So can you elaborate a little bit?
I think it will become clear once I go through the model. So if we have only idiosyncratic risk, the peso and the dollar will be perfect substitutes.
Okay, now I understand. Okay.
Because then there will be no aggregate risk in the economy. In the first, only idiosyncratic risk. So economy-wide, there's no risk in holding pesos, and the dollar is risk-free, so both are risk-free. Once I introduce a country-wide risk, then the dollar and the peso have a different aggregate risk profile. And they're not perfect substitutes anymore.
Okay, but then idiosyncratic risk favors any one of them? No, they have, like, my question is whether they have a symmetric growth towards idiosyncratic risk or not.
So this will become clear so the return on the two currencies might be different because it depends on the growth rate in Chile. If Chile is going well, you might hold pesos. If Chile is slowing down, you might go into dollars. It will be clear. I have a slide on that.
Okay.
Any other question?
There is no more questions.
Okay, so let me just jump into the analysis. So I will become a little bit more analysis at this point. So first I go on no aggregate risks. That's why this term here is gray. It doesn't show up hardly. In order to solve this model, we have to propose certain processes. So first of all, you remember the value of all pesos was P times K. That's the real value of all pesos in dollars. Okay? There's no aggregate risk. So P times K, P itself will be a constant, okay? Of course, K is growing at, what did we say, 3%? But P is constant, so the value of all pieces will also grow at 3%, but P itself will be constant. You see already why this P times K makes notational things simple. And the Q, the price of the machine, Q times K is the value of all the machines. The Q is also constant. Okay, there's no aggregate risk. Now we also have to propose a stochastic discount factor process. And the stochastic discount factor process, that's this C here. And the expected stochastic discount factor is just the risk-free rate. And that's, or put it differently, the stochastic discount factor process, the mean is the minus the risk-free rate. And then there's the price of risk, of idiosyncratic risk, because there's a tilde on top of it. That's this var sigma. And then we have this idiosyncratic risk of it. So the stochastic discount factor of a citizen I in Chile. Okay, that's very standard. It's just a continuous time. In discrete time, you have the same thing. But if you take the expected stochastic discount factor, you get 1 over the price of the bond. And that's why here it's just, you get, this would be e to the power minus r if you integrate it up. Okay. Now, let me remove this again. Now that's the return on money, and that's we had already before. So this equation we did already before. There's nothing new about it. Now with the return on capital, we did this too. So I don't have to tell you about this. So we have the return on money and we have the return on capital. So let's first consider a world where Chile is an autarky. There are capital controls. You can only hold Chilean government bonds or money, or you can hold physical capital. With physical capital, you have idiosyncratic risk, and the physical capital is also growing at the growth rate of the economy. That's the same thing what money grows. The difference is that if you hold physical capital, you also produce output. So money is not producing anything, but physical capital is producing output, consumption output, A minus iota, because iota is used to reproduce physical capital, which if iota is increasing, it gets worse here, but it makes things better here. Okay? And then there might be a money supply growth, which is an inflation tax, which brings the return on money down, but then the synergy is given to the capital owners. So this inflation tax is a capital subsidy. And the question is, if there's only return on money and return on capital, you cannot invest in dollars, that's your portfolio choice. The other choice you have to make is to make this a choice on this iota. No? This iota, you have to make a choice as well. That's what you do. You just maximize the return on money. That's a static problem. And you just maximize this iota, which I mentioned before, shows up here and shows up here. That gives you just this Tobin's Q. And what we typically do in this type of models, we assume that the adjustment cost function takes this log form, because then this iota is a very nice function. Iota is just 1 over kappa, Q minus 1. Sorry, my handwriting is not good for this laptop. And that's essentially what the investment rate is. It's the same for all the citizens. In all the citizens, they face, of course, different idiosyncratic shocks. So Fernando and Ernesto might be 10 times as wealthy as me, because they had some nice positive shocks and I suffered some negative shocks. But in terms of what we do in percentage terms as a fraction of our net worth, we do the same thing. We just, Fernando and Ernesto are 10 times scaled up versions of myself, okay? Now, what's the optimal portfolio choice? So one is the investment rate, iota. The other thing is the portfolio choice. The portfolio choice is, you compare the expected return, and you also compare it with the volatility of that. So the expected return is given by this. What you get the risk free, you can get the risk premium. The risk premium is the price of risk, this var sigma tilde times the risk itself. Okay, that's the risk premium. That's the expected return on capital. But what's the volatility on the idiosyncratic risk on it? That's given by the idiosyncratic risk divided by because it's a return. The return volatility is the volatility in cash flows divided by the price to get the return volatility. With log utility, we know the price of idiosyncratic risk or any risk is just this expression here. It's just the volatility of your net worth. 1 minus theta is in capital. That's a fraction which is in capital times sigma divided by theta. That's the return risk. That's the price of risk. Okay. So hence, if I plug everything in, I get the portfolio share in capital is given by that. The portfolio share in capital is if the volatility goes up, I put less in capital. So this goes down. If the expected return on capital goes up, I put more in capital, so this goes up. Okay? And it's just this nice Norton formula. Okay. If I plug everything in, what is the expected return? I plug it in from the previous thing, then I get this expression here. And that's essentially what gives me the optimal portfolio choice. So again, if the risk is going up, I put less in physical capital, I hold more, my portfolio share goes from, let's say, 60, 40, 60 in capital, 40 in money. The volatility goes up, it goes to 50, 50, okay? If the productivity is higher, but then I go more into physical capital. What's this? If money is printed at a faster rate, then I tax essentially inflation tax. I tax money holdings or government bond holdings. I get out of, so the tax goes higher. This whole term goes up too. That's the holding in capital. So the holding in money goes down and the holding in capital goes up. Okay? That's what's going on there. That's my portfolio. It's very simple. Then the third choice I have to make is my consumption choice because of log utility. So here I just do it for log utility for simplicity. It's just, my consumption is just rho, my time reference rate times net worth. So consumption net worth ratio is just rho. Okay. If I aggregate, in the aggregate economy, it's just total aggregate consumption demand is rho times the net worth of the whole economy. What is the net worth of the whole economy? P times K is the total wealth in form of money, which is turns out to be a bubble. Now there's money is not producing anything, but it gives me the service flow of being able to ensure idiosyncratic risk. And Q times K is the value of all the machines in the whole economy. It's capital K, so that's also capital C. There should be a little T here. Now I do market clearing. I have goods market clearing. That's the total output of goods market. So A times K is the total output. Iota times K is what I do for reinvesting in capital. That's my goods market clearing condition. And I have my capital markets clearing condition as well. So that's my portfolio share. Everybody picks the same portfolio share in capital holding relative to money holding. And that has to be the same, the total value of all capital divided by total value of all wealth in the economy. That's, that's the supply of the capital markets clearing condition. And I have money market clearing condition, which is satisfied by Walker's law. Okay. Now, if I put this all together, I can solve explicitly in closed form the whole thing. Okay, that's quite amazing. It's an Iodized model with different types of risk, which scales with capital you're holding. But I can solve it explicitly. I have the value of money, which is P times K. The value of machines is Q times K, and the iota. Everything is in explicit form, and everything can be solved explicitly in closed form. If you make risk aversion, you can still solve it. There's some gammas showing up, and for the risk aversion coefficient, it's a little bit more ugly, but you can still solve it explicitly. And just to show you, as idiosyncratic risk moves, if idiosyncratic risk is very low, if you're here, then the value of Piezo is always 0, because nobody wants to hold and use the service flow from insurance. If the insurance benefit, if there's almost no idiosyncratic risk, you don't need this insurance benefit. But if there's a lot of idiosyncratic risk in the economy, the value of money will be high and the value of machines will be low. So, and if you move from here to here, let's suppose there's an unexpected jump in idiosyncratic risk, then there will be flight to safety. People will try to get out of the machines, Q will go down, but the value of pesos will go up. There is disinflation. Okay? There's disinflationary pressure. So I see idiosyncratic risk moves around. So this is an important graph to understand how idiosyncratic risk, variation idiosyncratic risk change, here's only a comparative static exercise, later with the full dynamics, change the value of money. You can see if idiosyncratic risk goes up, people want to shift the portfolio from 60-40 to 50-50 and want to hold more pesos rather than machines. That brings the growth rate of the economy down. That's bad. But it also makes the value of pesos more highly valued, and the value of machines is going down. So that's what brings the growth rate, the investment rate down, and ultimately brings the growth rate down. Other questions about this? That was in an economy where there are only pesos, there's no dollar competition yet.
There is no question. Could you make that the final remark again? So if there is an increase in idiosyncratic uncertainty, then there is an investment depression. There is and B is going to be the exchange rate, or is going to be the inflation?
Yeah, so I do a comparative static exercise. Let's compare two economies, one which has, very bad financial markets. There's a lot of idiosyncratic risk people have to bear. Another economy where the idiosyncratic risk is not so bad, okay? In the second economy, the government debt and all the money, the pesos, is actually more valuable than in the first economy. They're both isolated in autarky, both economies. And as in the economy with high idiosyncratic risk, it's also the case that the value of the machines is lower because whenever you operate some physical operation, you have to bear more idiosyncratic risk. Okay. Now, if you were to jump unexpectedly from one steady state to another steady state, you see that there's flight to safety. People want to get out of physical capital. They want to get into this bubbly government bonds. Was this the question?
I see. Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. And of course, if I close if I have the whole dynamics, with expectations moving around, this was just an unexpected jump from one steady state to another steady state. I have to, of course, go into more depth to solve for the whole dynamic. Now what I want to do is I add also the dollar as a competing currency. So far it was only Pisa was on its own. Whenever there was a negative idiosyncratic risk was shooting up, the value of the Pisa was going up. But now it could be that suddenly you compete with the dollar. Why would you go into the Piezo? You might go into the dollar, in particular if the dollar gives you a more attractive interest rate. And that changes the whole dynamics. There's no disinflationary pressure from an idiosyncratic risk going up. It might now be that the Piezo cannot appreciate because the dollar is kicking in and doing the whole job. So now I do the other extreme. So let me first say I only have the dollar as safe asset. So there's no peso anymore. I have only the dollar. So the value of the peso is zero. Nobody wants to hold pesos anymore. There's also no medium of exchange or transaction role of money here. We can add this. It makes it a little bit more complicated, but it doesn't do the big picture. And so citizens now choose between physical capital and dollar holdings. And they can borrow also in dollars per unit of capital up to Q lower bar. So you can borrow and use your machine you bought in the international capital market as a collateral. Now what happens is that the dollar hoarding or the dollar holdings, I should say this nu, which is per capital. Remember this nu was dollars per capital unit. And it takes this form here. So if the interest rate is, if the idiosyncratic risk is very low, it's actually much better to have something which produces something. Okay, the interest rate, let's say on the dollar is okay, is not high, but the machines at home, they produce some dividend output and you have some output. So if the interest rate is sufficiently low in US dollars, you borrow in dollars. Okay, and if in particular, if the idiosyncratic risk is low, then, or in the extreme, let's suppose there's no idiosyncratic risk in running a machine, and there's no aggregate risks. Remember, we're still in the no aggregate risk setting, but then you want the machines because they're throw for dividend, and the US dollar, let's say, only gives you 2%, and your machines give you, 5%. Now, if the idiosyncratic risk goes up, you stay in this, and you want to borrow as much as possible. So if you had no borrowing constraint, you would go in the, if sigma tilde was 0, you go to minus infinity borrowing, but you go to the constraint. And then at some point, idiosyncratic risk becomes so high that you don't really want to go to the constraint, but you still borrow. And at some point, when idiosyncratic becomes even higher than this, you want to say, I don't want to borrow anymore. I want to use the dollar as a safe asset. I want to save in dollars because this allows me to share with my other fellow citizens. So whenever I face a negative shock, somebody else faces a positive shock, and I can sell my US treasuries to the other guy, and then I have some funds at this point, and we can overcome this incoming market frictions. Okay. So this is essentially the dollar holdings of the citizens in Chile. Okay.
Markus?
Yeah.
Quick question. If I remove the borrowing constraint here, I go back to the previous case?
Yes, because
okay, yeah, I wanted to know that.
Oh no, sorry, no, you don't go back to previous case here because the dollars are totally supplied inelastically. Or the price of the dollars, because you're a small open economy, you don't have any impact on the value of the dollar. So in the previous case, it was pesos. You control this total supply of the currency in pesos, and it's a fixed supply, or it grows at a fixed rate, let's say. And then, you know, if sigma tilde goes up, you ask for more pesos, and the value of pesos will appreciate. Here, the dollar is not appreciating or depreciating because you're just a small open economy.
Okay, and in terms of the results, what would I get if I remove the borrowing constraint? And what's the difference?
The model is not well specified because you would borrow an infinite amount.
Okay, yeah, you're right. Thanks.
So let me go to this picture on this side. I think that's the important one. So the question is, you know, what is the required return on a safe asset? So it is a portfolio return minus the risk premium on that. And, you know, if the idiosyncratic risk is very low, let's suppose we are here somewhere, you would actually say, in order for you to hold a safe asset, you have to give me just quite some return on it, okay? Because, you know, let me go back to 0 again. There's no idiosyncratic risk at all. What do I get by holding physical capital? I get actually the growth rate of the economy, you know? And I get the dividend on top of it, okay? So my required return is pretty high. As the idiosyncratic risk goes up, my required return of holding some dollars is actually going down, or holding some you know, safe asset is going down. So the more the idiosyncratic risk is, the less you have to give me to hold this safe asset. Okay. Now, then the other question is, so I shouldn't have, so I forget what I circled here. A second, I have some troubles with my computer here. So let me say this again. If there's no idiosyncratic risk at all, the required rate of return is this one. As the idiosyncratic risk goes up, you want to ensure through holding the safe asset, and you don't need so high a return anymore to get to hold the safe asset. Okay. Now the blue line is my growth rate. That's what this thing represents. Okay. So what happens if idiosyncratic risk goes up? Let's first focus on this element here. If idiosyncratic risk is going up a lot, then it will be the case that you don't want to invest so much anymore. You don't want to hold so much capital. So the Q is depressed, and hence the investment rate is depressed as well, and the economy doesn't grow so fast anymore. And if the government doesn't print any money, let's suppose it's fixed, the return on the local government, on the pesos, is actually growth rate of the economy. Remember, we said Chile is growing at 3%. If Chile grows at 3% and there's no money supply growth rate, the deflation is 3%. And that's a return on money. Now, if Chile goes at 4%, the return on money would be 4%. If Chile goes at 2%, the return would be only 2%. And let's suppose now there's no money supply growth rate. Chile is not printing any money, okay, for simplicity. And the higher the idiosyncratic risk is, the less people want to actually hold physical capital, the lower Q will be, and the lower Q is the iota, the investment rate is lower, and that also means the capital growth rate is lower. And that's why this thing is coming down here, okay? So the blue line is essentially the growth rate of the economy. And we have to figure out this raising business. And that's essentially what's going on. That this is increasing here, that depends on this gamma, the risk aversion being 2. I don't want to go into that. But the important thing is this is actually coming down here. Now, this is in a world, I just plotted here the growth rate of Chile when they can only hold dollars. And what you can see is that in the next slide, if the growth rate of Chile and the dollar interest rate is 2%, okay, let's say the real return on dollars is 2%, and Chile can actually provide a currency which gives you a growth rate equal to the growth rate of the economy, which is above 2%. So in this range, when the idiosyncratic volatility is above this point here, the growth rate of Chile is below 2%, and the peso is not viable. Nobody will hold a peso because the return, even if there's no money supply growth rate, the only thing is what Chile can do, they can actually tax citizens and have a negative money supply growth rate in order to support the peso. That's very costly, okay? So, but generally, the peso will not survive in this area, okay? In this area, the peso is available because the growth rate of the economy is above 2%, and it's also above the required return people need for a safe asset, okay? So it's above the 2% here and above this black line. So here the peso is viable. In this range here, it is the case that actually capital is so attractive because there's so little idiosyncratic risk to it that nobody wants to hold a safe asset. If it only gives you this blue return, you get a much higher return on the physical capital stock, okay? So that's essentially what's going on. We have 3 regions. One region where the peso is not viable at all because the dollar is so attractive, or the US treasuries are so attractive. And then there's another region where the physical capital is so attractive and it's not viable either. And there's a middle region where the peso is viable. Okay, and that's, the peso itself will take a bubble form. So if you just, the economy grows at, let's say 3%, and you know, that's fine. You can offer a 3% interest rate on, and it's very attractive to hold this peso on top of the physical capital. So you have a nice portfolio mix on that. And the dollar with 2% is not attractive. What you do in this range, essentially, you borrow in dollars. Okay? So you borrow in dollars, and the fact that you can borrow in dollars allows you to scale up, and the growth rate will be higher too. And you don't need any fiscal backing on this peso because, you know, it grows faster than the economy. Now, if we put this together, you might not offer an interest rate which is equal to the growth rate. You can also offer an interest rate which is below the growth rate, which is the blue one is the growth rate. You offer something below, you can still support it at the currency. Okay? There's only room for one currency in this framework, in this idiosyncratic risk only framework, because there's no aggregate risk. So the peso is totally safe and the dollar is totally safe. They're perfect substitutes. You go always for the one who gives you the higher expected return or higher return because there's no risk in it. Okay? So there's only room for one currency because there's no aggregate risk. Remember, there's still idiosyncratic risk with tilde. And in this range here, if you were to jump, if there's a competitive study, there's a sudden stop. So remember what you do. If the dollar interest rate is 2% and the peso gives you, the peso government bond, it's also risk-free, gives you 3%, you go short the dollar as much as you can. You go to a borrowing constraint. So you're here, down here, and then hold the Piezo asset and physical capital. Okay, but if you ever were to jump over this point, the idiosyncratic risk goes up here, then suddenly the dollar becomes more attractive. Everybody will sell the Piezo debt, and they're totally short here. And then if you jump over there, they'll sell Piezo debt and they hold any dollars in the long position. Okay, they get out of Piezo altogether. There's no medium of exchange role of money. They get totally out of it. First, they were borrowing in dollars and holding Piezos. Suddenly, they go out of Piezos and only in dollars as a safe asset. In combination, they still hold some physical capital on it, but that's essentially what's going on. Now, the policy space that's what the equilibrium outcome is. I'm running really low here, late here. The equilibrium outcome is that there's a sudden stop, and the higher the idiosyncratic risk is, and if the idiosyncratic risk is very high, the growth rate of the economy suffers, hence the return on the Piezo suffers, and at some point, the Piezo can't keep up with the dollar, and there's a sudden stop going on. And before that happens, they were borrowing all the way to the borrowing limit, and then suddenly they're saving in dollars. So from borrowing in dollars to saving in dollars, and before that, they were borrowing in dollars, holding Piezos and physical capital. Subsequently, if the idiosyncratic risk jumps beyond the threshold, move not borrowing in dollars, only then now saving in dollars and holding still some physical capital. Now I use some policy space. This was in a world where there's no policy space. I can have capital controls on it. I might not allow my citizens to get out into the dollar. I can back my Piezo with taxes. I mentioned this before. I can impose negative supply growth of money by taxing my citizens and support my Piezos. I can do many things. And in general, there's always a trade-off. So I can raise the value of the Piezo. This gives me better insurance at home if I don't want to use the dollar, but it lowers my Q, the value of the machines, and also then lowers the growth rate in the economy. Let me just go quickly what the optimal thing is. That's very interesting as well. The blue lines was the equilibrium outcome as a function of sigma tilde. Okay. So what the blue line says, when is a money possible? And you see if the idiosyncratic risk is not high enough, money is not possible because capital is just too attractive. It gives a high dividend yield. Money doesn't give you the dividend yield. So you just go for capital. And in that range, everybody is holding a lot of capital, but there's still a carry this idiosyncratic risk around. And it would be nice to have money there to allow some insurance across the idiosyncratic risks through safe asset holdings. What you want to do is the optimal policy, the red line, you want to subsidize money holdings. How do you do this? By having negative money supply growth. You really push inflation taxes down to negative territory in order to get this thing. But if you're a more realistic region where the idiosyncratic risk is up here, then actually it is the case that the optimal policy is that, is in equilibrium, people hold too much money. The portfolio share is too much in money and too little in physical capital. You would like to push them out of money into physical capital to productive stuff. And the way to achieve that is to impose some inflation tax. So you have a high optimal inflation rate, you push for an inflation rate to change portfolio allocation away from money towards physical capital in order to stimulate the economy. And if physical capital Q goes up, the investment rate goes up, and it lifts the whole economy out of a low growth rate environment. Now you can see if I now allow the Piezo dollar competition on top of it, this blue thing what we had before. Now, remember the blue thing was, I just changed the color. This was all competitive static exercises, not fully dynamic yet. If the idiosyncratic risk is low, we borrow. So 0 is here. We borrow all the way to the limit. This was the limit. We go negative in dollar holdings. And if you jump over this line, we go positive in dollar holdings. We only hold dollars. We don't have only local currency anymore. Now, the optimal currency essentially holding is that in this world, you would always hold local currency. Okay. So it's always the case that you don't want to do this dollar. You always borrow in dollars, and then you hold the optimal currency at home. So you'd like to impose capital controls. And that's, you can see already in this framework, so you don't want the sudden stop jump. That's very bad to have. You would like to have a much smoother relationship. Of course, the dollar holdings are going up. If your growth rate is very low because sigma tilde is very high, then you want to borrow a lot in dollars, and you want to smoothly go up already, while in equilibrium you stay flat. In the optimal allocation, you go up in dollar holdings already, and then there's not this jump going up here. It's going, you know, further smooth. There's no jump like this and going up this way. And you can see the much more smooth relationship also in the growth rate of the economy, that the optimal growth rate of the economy is given by that, by the red line, where the equilibrium one is given by the blue line. And you might ask, the equilibrium has a higher growth rate than the optimal one. It's indeed the case, the equilibrium is higher, the equilibrium growth rate is higher than the optimal one, but it comes at a cost that people bear a lot of idiosyncratic risk, and they get some disutility from bearing all this idiosyncratic risk. So there's not much risk sharing through the safe asset, and that's why the equilibrium is fast. So people say, okay, I bear this risk. The safe asset is not really good, and I hold a lot of physical capital, even though I don't like it, but I have to bear this risk.
Markus, may I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
Extrapolating the model to some real world situation, how much is a reasonable sigma tilde? Because you just show us sigma tilde is a free variable. We can get it as high as we want, but I want to have a sense of what is a reasonable level for that sigma tilde.
So we are looking into that. So you probably want to look. It's not so easy to measure because we haven't measured it much yet. But we look at the cross section of default risk of corporate bonds, for example. I'm looking with Arvind Krishnamurthy on this, and how it changed most recently. So that's probably one way to measure it, to get a sense. I think it's probably pretty high. You know, if you own a restaurant, there's a lot of, or any other shop, there's a lot of risk you cannot really insure. I mean, you can insure something, you sell some defaultable bond to the banking sector, and it gives you some insurance, but it's fairly limited in a sense. So there's people who still have to hold a lot of idiosyncratic risk, but I can't give you a number. So if I go back to my charts, I'm pretty sure that, you know, you're not down. I have to paste that. You're not at 0.2 or something. I think it's. I don't think you also are at the range where the Piezo cannot compete anymore with the dollar. I think my guess is you are at the critical level somewhere here. So that's where the, you know, stop occurs here. That's also what shows up here.
Okay, so if we want to use this model to think about the COVID crisis right now,
Yes.
If you want to postpone this question to the end, that's fine.
Yeah, let's postpone it to the end because otherwise, but no, perhaps let's do it. In the COVID crisis, I can view the COVID crisis an increase is a negative shock. There's, of course, an increase in aggregate volatility. I have to talk about this too. But as an increase of idiosyncratic risk, I don't know whether my will be hit or my street will be hit or not. I mean, there's in Germany, for example, there's a lot of local openings, and it depends, you know, what was the health statistic in your local town. And you might be hit more or less. And this is totally beyond your control, but there's a lot of idiosyncratic risk. And initially, you don't know which industries are hit and which ones can open up first, and there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment.
Okay, thanks.
But I have to be honest, we haven't all these numbers are not calibrated. It's just an illustration of what happens. There's still a lot of work to be done how to calibrate this thing. Because
sorry, Marcus, there is another question. Sorry for interrupting again. There is another question by Jorge Lorca. We want to unmute you, Jorge, so you could speak. So you can speak.
Thank you. Thank you. My question is, if we all anticipate we may possibly jump from an equilibrium in which a currency is valued to an equilibrium in which the same currency is worthless, are there alternative policies beyond only capital controls? Because I'm thinking, maybe incorrectly, that there's some like a Nayagari type motive for hoarding dollars ex ante. So I'm thinking about instead of thinking about capital controls, is there a possibility for thinking about providing derivatives market, so like an alternative policy? That's my question.
So there are two answers to that. So first one is, of course, what I only did here is essentially comparing different steady states of different sigma tildes, which is like an unanticipated jump of sigma tilde. In reality, in the model, in the full model, sigma tilde can move around. And you say, oh, we're close, we are down here, and you will not totally ignore. There's some feedback. You will not totally ignore that you might jump over there, and this might reflect already the value of the currency. And the full model, which what I do when we have aggregate shocks, will take this into account. Now I forgot the second. Oh, then derivatives. So that's the initial assumption we made, that certain risks, like volatility risks, you cannot trade. That's where the incubate market assumption comes in. I then come back to, Sebastian de Teller's job market paper from several years ago. He showed that you might open these markets, but nobody wants to trade these markets. So I don't know how it would work in this setting now, in this particular setting, but it's not obvious that people will take the optimal position in these markets if you can trade some volatility instruments. But that's an interesting question. But the basic friction we have is that you cannot trade idiosyncratic risk. You cannot insure against that. That's a key friction we need. That's our assumption. And you can also not trade this aggregate risk. Once you can, if you can trade everything, then you're back to a classic area complete market setting. These are the two key assumptions we make. That otherwise, I think the model is very, very standard.
We have in total 6 minutes left.
6 minutes. Oh my
Yes.
God. Okay.
Time flies.
Okay, so let me just recap. So idiosyncratic risk creates the money, and let me just say, now I can go to the other extreme. I can say there are only countrywide shocks. Okay, there's no idiosyncratic risk. Now, what's the problem there? I just give you the hunch, given that we're only 6 minutes. This is like a firm saying, how much cash should I hold? Okay, so let's just look at a firm who decides how much dollar reserves to hold and say, okay, I might face all these aggregate shocks as a firm, or I face the shocks as a firm. At some points, I have to buy some capital. At some points, I can sell capital, but there's a wedge between the buying and the selling price. This Q upper bound, this Q lower bound. Remember, if there's only idiosyncratic risk, the Q was fixed. Now, if only aggregate risk, it's like, okay, at some point, I have, great shocks. I want to buy more machines. I have to pay Q upper bar. Sometimes I have very little output. I want to sell some of the machines at Q lower bar. And that gives me this aggregate risk. And I want to save against this risk moving around. And for this, I have some dollar cash holdings. Okay, and think of a big firm in the US. It just makes an optimal decision. That's a paper by Bolton, Chang, and Wang, which analyzes the optimal cash holdings. The same is true also for Chile as a whole economy. If there's no idiosyncratic risk, Chile itself is like a firm. So, okay, at some point we want to buy some machines, at some point we want to sell machines, and there's a wedge in the prices. And we have to solve an optimal problem. How many machines to buy, how many dollars to hold. And it's the same thing. And you can also see that given that there's no idiosyncratic risk, what Chile does as a country is also what each citizen would do in the country, because each citizen is essentially the same. It's a representative agent economy. Even some might be wealthier, others might be less wealthy, but it aggregates nicely up without idiosyncratic risk. Okay, so let me summarize this. If we have only countrywide shocks, only these aggregate shocks, the optimal dollar holdings, there's nothing, pesos don't make any sense, because there's no idiosyncratic risk. There's nothing you can do with pesos. We're all the same anyway, all Chilean citizens. The only thing is we want to insure ourselves against these countrywide shocks, we hold some dollar reserves. And that's the same thing what the country would do and the equilibrium outcome would do. So there's no difference between equilibrium and what the country would do. Okay, so let me just say the countrywide shocks, if I increase the aggregate volatility from this is my need, it's the dollar holdings per unit of capital. So typically, if the aggregate shocks are low, I will actually have negative dollar holdings. I borrow in dollars because the dollar interest rate is fairly low. I don't know, it's 2% relative to the growth rate in this economy. And if the aggregate risk goes up to 15%, then actually the economy will live here. So let me just the distribution. So the dollar holdings move around. There will be, let's say before 15%, you will be in dollar debt. Sometimes you have dollar holdings. It moves back and forth depending what shocks you face. If you have positive shocks, you hold some dollars, and if this builds up for too much, then you buy with these dollars. You buy some machines, some expensive machines, and so forth. So that's essentially distribution of dollar holdings with 15%, and that's how the drift is. If the dollar holding goes down into this territory, then the drift is positive. You accumulate dollars. You have negative shocks. Remember the output shocks. You have negative output shocks. You sell fewer output, so the dollar holdings are going down. And then from the shocks, you drift the whole thing up again. You sell some of the machines and so forth. If you have a lot of dollar holdings, you got a lot of output. Let's say you sell some of the machines in order to get the dollar holdings up again. And you live in this territory here with 15%, and that's how the Q lives. And the Q translates into investment rate. Higher Q means high investment rate, higher growth rate. That's the same. These two translate to each other. And if the aggregate volatility is lower, then it's just the red lines, corresponding red lines. You can also do comparative static. What happens if now the interest rate in the US is 5% and it moves down to 0%? You can just see with 5%, you have this distribution of the dollar holdings. So you borrow, because if you pay a 5% interest rate, you borrow only not often of the time in this state of the world, and otherwise you hold dollars. But if it moves to 0, then actually the whole distribution shifts to this dashed line. And you also see that if the interest rate in the US is lower, you borrow much more in dollar and hold more machines. Having more machines, the price of the machines is typically higher. You live now in this space here, and the price of the machines is higher, the growth rate is higher compared to a 5% interest rate. Okay? The volatility is actually lower too, but that shows you how influential the dollar interest rate is on your local economy. Now, then I have to put both of these things together. Now, if I have only countrywide shocks, I have no pesos, I have only dollars. I've analyzed already the interaction between pesos and dollars in only idiosyncratic risk, but it's a bang-bang solution in a sense, because peso and dollars are both risk-free, and depending what the growth rate is in the economy, if the growth rate in the economy is high, then I can support pesos. Everybody wants to hold pesos and go short in dollars as much as they can with the borrowing constraint. When the growth rate in the economy is low, everybody wants to hold only dollars and nobody wants to hold pesos. The peso collapses. And this was in only idiosyncratic risk. In only countrywide risk, we only thought about the dollar holdings to ensure the countrywide risk. The pesos don't help for that. And so now we have to solve for the general results if we combine all of it. And I cannot go into that. Sorry for that. I just skip all of that. I will show you some outcome. So what we do here is we say, again, we have the state variable is the dollar savings, okay? And we do it for different levels of idiosyncratic risk. Okay? Let me just tildes. So here you can see the idiosyncratic risk is here is 0. That's how your dollar holding moves around. And here the idiosyncratic risk is 35%. That's the pink line here. And you move all around this setting here. And that's a drift. So again, what we had before, that's a drift of 0. If your dollar holding is below that, you accumulate dollars. If your dollar holding is above that level, it's over there, you decumulate, so the drift is negative. And you can see how things move around. The more interesting graph is this one here, the panel B. What does this panel B show you? That's the portfolio weight on the local currency. And it gives you this inverted U shape again. So if there's no idiosyncratic risk, you hold almost no pesos. Why? Because the local capital stock is so much more valuable. But if the idiosyncratic risk goes up, then you want to hold more pesos. You hold more and more pesos. So this goes up as the idiosyncratic risk goes up, and then it comes back down. If the idiosyncratic risk goes up further and further, then the growth rate, so physical capital holding becomes more risky. You don't want to hold so much physical capital. That depresses the growth rate in the economy. That also makes the peso less competitive to the dollar. And then the dollar takes over and the peso collapses. Okay, so very low idiosyncratic risk is not good for the peso because that makes the physical capital so attractive. It's good for the economy and good for the citizens, but not for creating available currency in your own country. Then the idiosyncratic risk goes up. Then there becomes a range. Then the value of the currency is going up and up and up. Everything is a competitive static exercise. And as it becomes, the idiosyncratic risk goes up and up and up. People they want to hold more of the money, be it in dollars or in pesos. And this drives out the physical investment and brings the growth rate of the economy down. As the growth rate of the economy goes down, the peso cannot compete with the dollar so much, and that makes it ultimately the dollar can take over and the peso collapse as well. Okay, and that's what's showing up here. Now here what we did is the same full analysis for monetary spillovers from the United States for different interest rates for the United States. So 0, 2%, 2.5%, 3%. You see how the dollar holdings vary. So if the interest rate is 0, then mostly you borrow from the US and sometimes you hold a little bit of the dollars. But if the interest rate is 3%, you live in this space. Okay, as you move around, everything is stochastic. You move back and forth. That's the space you live in, depending on what the recent shocks were. And then you mostly hold dollars as safe asset. Okay, and again here again what's the peso holding, and you can see already with no interest rate the peso is very attractive. So the portfolio share goes all the way up to 60% in peso holdings. But if the US is offering a much higher interest rate, you can never go beyond 10% of portfolio share in pesos. If it's 3%, the peso collapses in this particular numeric example. So nothing is calibrated, but we just show the idea. And then you can show optimal policy. The optimal policy essentially shows is that if you can control the whole system, you would like to borrow much more in dollars, boost your growth rate in the local economy, and live with that. So in a sense, you're not so prudent. So the market is much more prudent. So optimal policy, socially optimal policy is much more borrowing in dollars and hold your local currency. So let me just conclude, but let me just say one thing. The optimal policy is indeed to use the dollars to hedge aggregate country-wide shocks and use the pesos to hedge idiosyncratic shocks within the country, okay? The problem is that the dollar and the peso compete. You cannot keep this separately. So you would like, as a plan, I would like to say, whatever idiosyncratic risk-safe asset we need to hedge to improve our risk sharing, we would like to do it with pesos. Whatever the international shock size, we would like to hedge this with dollar holdings. If you have total capital controls on, you can do this as central bank. You say, okay, we hold the reserves, the dollar reserves, and we don't allow citizens to hold the reserves, US dollars, and we do manage the pesos at home and to manage the idiosyncratic risk. If you have open capital controls, you cannot do this because the citizens suddenly start, actually the dollar is more attractive than the peso holding as a high interest rate. And because of that, they will use the US Treasury as a safe asset and not the pesos anymore. And that brings the whole growth rate of in Chile down as well, okay? So what we did is we built a model where the value of money as a store of value is actually endogenous. So the local currency you would like to use to insure against idiosyncratic risk. In global currency, like the US dollar, you would like to use to insure against country-wide risk optimally, ideally. But people also use it to insure against the idiosyncratic risk and crowd out the local currency in a sense. And that gives you an endogenous exchange rate between dollars and pesos as well. So the optimal policy, as I mentioned before, without idiosyncratic risk, we have only aggregate risk, equilibrium is optimal. Once you have idiosyncratic risk and aggregate risk, the things are screwed up because the separation, which you ideally would like to do, you can't do anymore. The equilibrium effects, equilibrium dollar savings are rising with idiosyncratic risk. That kills the local currency essentially. The currencies are imperfect substitutes. So traditional monetary models, which are very much driven by a medium of exchange, considerations here, it's more store of value. But many of these models, they're perfect substitutes. Here, they're imperfect substitutes because they have different risk profile if you have aggregate risk. And the value of a currency is this humped U-shaped in idiosyncratic risk. Initially, it's not where, if idiosyncratic risk is very low, then nobody wants to hold currency because inflation pressures are high, because people think it's much more profitable to hold physical capital. The economy might be overheating. If idiosyncratic risk is very, very high, there's a risk off scenario, idiosyncratic risk is very, very high, but then it is the case that the growth rate in the economy is too low to support the currency, and people are also rushing the dollar. And only in the intermediate range, the dollar can happen. And that's, of course, the two important messages: this sudden stop. If the idiosyncratic risk jumps up, or the risk-off environment, there's a sudden stop because people, instead of borrowing in dollars, they now hoard dollars. It's a radical shift in attitude. And the interest rate in the US makes a huge difference for these countries.
Great. Thank you very much, Markus. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. It's been a very insightful webinar. So thank you very much for all of you to be with us. Next week, same time, 11:30, we have Ricardo Caballero, who will be speaking to us. Thank you very much, Markus, again, and see you all next week.
Okay, see you next week. Or whatever. Thanks.
Bye-bye.